everybody. Good evening. Good evening, all of you. Uh, it's a matter of, you know, great happiness that this is the fourth consecutive international webinar we are having on the specific theme Gandhi. Today, our speaker is Mr. Ashish Kothari, the environmentalist activist. He is the founder member of Kalpavriksha. He is going to give a talk. The title of the talk is Gandhian Perspectives on Self-Reliance and Non-Violence, Social Work for Achieving Food Sovereignty. This is an important topic in this time. So in this talk, Dr. Malti Madam would moderate following the talk. But before the talk begins, before Malti Madam introduces the speaker, I would like to invite Professor Singla, head of the department, who has been pursuing this series so much since last summer vacation. I would like to invite Professor Singla for her opening remarks. Over to you, Madam Singla.
Thank you, Dr. Behra, and a very good evening to all, and welcome to yet another webinar in our series on Gandhi. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Mr. Ashish Kothari. He's the founder member, as has been introduced, of Kalpavriksha. And as you all know, he has much to his credit, which we'll get to hear from Dr. Malti in a few minutes from now. And just to introduce, Dr. Malti will be the moderator for today's session. Ashish ji, it's indeed an honor to have you speak to us today, and on behalf of my department and the University of Delhi, I extend a very warm welcome to you.
Yep.
Friends, Mr. Ashish Kothari will be speaking on the Gandhian perspective on self-reliance and non-violence in context of social work for achieving food sovereignty, and we look forward to listening to him. I also welcome everyone who has taken out time to join us for this webinar, my colleagues from the department, and we have colleagues also from other universities. The students groups who are there, and our senior faculty and senior alumni who have graced the occasion by their presence, and I warmly welcome them. As has been already said earlier by me in the earlier three webinars, that this year we are celebrating the Platinum Jubilee of the Department of Social Work, and today's webinar is the fourth in our Platinum Jubilee series in the current academic year. And it is our first national webinar and the fourth, of course, in the Gandhi series. And we have already shared with you that Professor Ajay Sakaria, Professor Dennis Talton, Professor Teal Bill have been our earlier speakers. And we continue to rejoice and celebrate this 150th birth anniversary of Gandhi. Ashish, for your information, we are a department of 22 faculty. It's a mix of young and senior faculty, which makes it a very good blend of experience and enthusiasm. And we have over 150 students currently enrolled, and we are looking forward to welcoming the new batch of students. Hopefully they should be joining us by 1st of November. And we all take a lot of pride in being a part of this legacy known as the Delhi School of Social Work. So again, for your information, since you must, of course, you know about it since you've been a product of Delhi University, Hindu College, Sociology. So for your benefit and for others who are there, the Department of Social Work has popularly been known as the Delhi School of Social Work. And it was started in 1946 at Lucknow as the National YWCA School of Social Work. And it was in 1947 that it shifted to Delhi, and later on in the university campus with the Sir Maurice Square as the Vice Chancellor. And it's interesting, and in fact, we take a lot of pride to say that, I think it was the first batch of students in 1947 who had met Gandhiji here at Delhi, and he had actually asked them what they were doing, and his approval of the work that they were doing was a high point in their lives. And as a gift, Mr. Ashish, as a gift to the great leader for his birthday, the best written resolutions of the social work students were put together and gifted to Gandhi, and it was named as the first copy of the accepted oath, which went to the Mahatma on his last birthday. So such is the rich history of the department, which is actually entwined with the history of blood-stained nation. And a lot has changed, of course, since then by way of our curriculum, by way of our fieldwork. Fieldwork, is the integral part here, and by way of the department infrastructure, student profile. But the passion to work with people, to reach out to people, still continues to stay. And social work, as you know it very well, draws heavily from the Gandhian thought. And hence, what could be better for us than to celebrate the 75 years of our existence with the 150th birth anniversary of this great leader by revisiting his values and principles through our webinar series on Gandhian thought in social work practice. And the talk today, which is on Gandhian perspective on self-reliance and non-violence. And before I hand it over to Dr. Bera and Malti, I take this opportunity to express my gratitude to all the members of the webinar committee. We have a webinar committee, which is a very active committee. So I express my gratitude to all the members of the webinar committee, the members of the faculty members for their support in carrying forward this initiative, and the students of the department to make this event come alive. And once again, I extend a very warm welcome to you, Ashish, and to everyone present with us today. Over to Dr. Pratap Bera and Dr. Malti. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Now I would request Dr. Malti to introduce our guest, the speaker, and before I request Malti madam to introduce the speaker and welcome the guest to speak, I request the audience to mute their mic, and they should not also make their screen in a presentation mode. It disturbs the event. So this is a humble request to one and all. Now I request Malti madam to welcome and introduce the guest, and followed by moderating the talk. Over to Malti madam.
Thank you, Pratap ji, and thank you, Professor Singla. We are really very happy to have Mr. Ashish Kothari here. And as Professor Singla has mentioned, that he is an alumnus of our university, and we really take pride in welcoming him. There is so much written on him. Actually, if somebody Googles, then you will know a lot. But we are just doing a sample of that a little bit, just to introduce the speaker and the kind of work that he has done, and how that is so relevant to our topic today. So Mr. Ashish Kothari, he brings with him a rich academic and field experience. He has written extensively, and particularly in working and networking with various organizations at the grassroots level on environmental and developmental issues. And we know of his association with Narmada Bachao Andolan, Beach Bachao Andolan. And also he has connected with various organizations which are providing a kind of a radical alternatives to the current scenario, yet with the sprinkling of elements of non-violence and assertion of Swaraj. I also want to share that he has contributed extensively in being a member of the expert committees in making the National Biodiversity Act and the National Wildlife Act, Biodiversity Act 2002, and the National Wildlife Action Plan. And he has been continuously working with national, international organizations, academics, and activists in making these alternatives available to us in various fora. There are certain organizations like Vikalp Sangam is one such thing. It's a confluence of that alternatives that are there, and we have always been recommending this, Mr. Kothari, to our students. And then we also have him as global tapestry of alternatives. That also I think people should see and understand what kind of a vision that is being presented as also as activism. We also want our audience to know that he has written so many books, almost 35 books, and some 400 or so articles probably more now since we looked at the website. So the churning the earth, making of global India, alternative futures, India unshackled, and pluriverse, a post-development dictionary. And this I was able to download only recently and pass it on to my MPhil scholars. So I really welcome Mr. Ashish Kothari to share with us on this important theme. This theme has come about because we are very much concerned with the pandemic and how it has eroded our food sovereignty, and how it has not that it is a recent phenomena, but it has been there for a long. But we would like Mr. Ashish Kothari, who not only will to provide a critique but also a construct, and we believe that he does so very effectively. So once again, I now thank Mr. Ashish Kothari and my colleagues Pratap Chandra Behra and Pamela ma'am. And now I hand over the space to Mr. Kothari.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's wonderful, even if it's virtual, to be coming back to Delhi University. Hopefully, it will be physical also soon. So thanks to the department and to Pamela ji, Pratap ji, Malati ji, and everybody else who's made this possible. And thanks especially to the students for coming late in the evening at a time when I'm sure it would be much more fun to be enjoying oneself doing something else. I should start by saying that I am in no way an expert on Gandhi. I think the three people who've spoken before me are much more conversant with Gandhi's enormous amount of work, writings and actions and activities in life and so on. I also notice people like Mark Lindley here, so I'm a little hesitant to say anything in any way which sounds conclusive about Gandhi, given the kind of people that are here. But so my experience and what I will talk about is actually much more based on what I've seen with people's movements and initiatives on the ground. And I'll talk about a number of those movements and how either explicitly or implicitly they bring out various Gandhian concepts. But also I'll point out later, it's not just Gandhi, but in fact, a lot of these movements kind of break down the so-called ideological divides between Gandhi and Marx and Ambedkar and so on in very interesting ways. And I think that's something which is well worth looking at. I also want to say that my own perspective, and I think probably Gandhi would agree to this, is that social work itself needs to go beyond the charity approach. And I know that the department has always emphasized this, to go beyond the charity approach, to look at how we can actually enable or facilitate the agency of the communities and the people themselves, rather than say that, okay, we're here to help you, to actually say, okay, we're here to actually facilitate and help in the self-empowerment that you people are trying to do. So that's a perspective I'll try and give all through the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to start the slides now, and just tell me whether... Oh, I'm hearing some echo. I don't know where from.
Pratap ji, some echo is there.
Yeah, so please, mute others who.
Asif,
Okay,
please
you can
mute
see the
yourself.
slide?
We'll request everyone to mute. Yes, we can see. Yes, it's visible.
Okay, so let me start by saying that everything that I say about Gandhi in terms of the appreciation of what an incredible man he was and his ideas, I should also say, because this is often something that I get presented with at the end of any such presentation, saying, oh, you think Gandhi was perfect and his views on caste and women and blah, 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 all that. And I think it's important to recognize that, like anybody else and any other great person from history, he was a person, he was a human being, and of course had flaws as a human being. And it becomes very easy for us to put people like that on an icon, on a pedestal, and then knock them down. They never claimed to be perfect, and we should not look at them in that way. Nor did they claim, any of these people claim, that all the ideas they had and all the work they did was their own, but that they were in fact constantly building on other people's work and actions and so on. So I wanted to start by acknowledging this. Now, I think the context in which I want to talk about Swaraj and self-reliance is the context of the enormous amounts of violence that we are seeing around the world, that we've been seeing for many decades, in fact, many centuries now, if you think of colonialism, against both the rest of nature, as you see in this image, and against communities, especially those who are most directly dependent on nature and natural resources for their survival and their livelihoods and their cultural sustenance and so on. And it's also a process, this process of development and modernization, westernized modernization especially, has also been a process of cultural domination, cultural accumulation, cultural and physical and intellectual and spiritual subjugation of peoples across the earth. And in that sense, what many of us think of development is not really development, but it's a form of violence. We also see that it's not just violence against people and against the rest of nature and communities, but also in terms of the kind of sharp divisions that are being created within humanity itself. You look at inequalities across the world, including in India, they are at abysmally high levels, not despite the development process, but in fact, I would say because of the nature of development that we have. We also see, and since we're talking especially about food today, that in India, despite all the record amount of economic growth that we've had in the last 30 years, and the claims to be now the 5th largest economy in the world and so on, there's an enormous amount of deprivation, according to us. A book that a colleague and I, Asim Srivastava and I, wrote a few years back, at least 2/3 of India are deprived of basic needs, including of adequate nutritious food. I think one of the recent surveys, 2 recent surveys actually from government institutions, both suggest that rural people especially are eating less and less nutritious food compared to 20 to 30 years back. The COVID crisis has, of course, made all of this much worse, partly because of the health thing, but in fact, even more so because of the nature of the economic lockdown that has been imposed by the government, with very little attempt at trying to provide alternatives, especially to the most marginalized populations. And in fact, COVID has become a time for, instead of re-examining our relationship with the rest of the earth and with each other, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, including in India, the state especially seems to be going towards more authoritarianism, less Swaraj, more, and private corporations are, of course, profiting significantly from this. We also see a lot of doublespeak, a lot of what I would call hypocrisy. And I'm sorry if I make anybody uncomfortable, but I'm always been a very plain-speaking person. To me, for instance, what is being characterized as Atmanirbhar Bharat is nothing to do with self-reliance at all. If we say that coal mining in central India, which will displace tens of thousands of people and destroy some of the most valuable forests of the country, is self-reliance, then I think we really have to wonder what is meant by the word. So this is the sort of backdrop that we have. We also see that in the policies and programs of any government, not just the current one, but for the last 30 years possibly, there's a lot of lip service that has been paid to Gandhi and other similar figures, but in fact, he is being assassinated every day in the kind of policies and programs that we are seeing. And with this government in particular, it's much worse. And so I think if poor Gandhiji was to come back to life and walk down any of the so-called MG roads, I think we have them in Delhi and Pune and many other cities. A lot of young people actually don't even know what MG stands for anymore. But the Mahatma Gandhi roads are the ones where you actually see the full scale of globalization. And he would have been extremely confused as to what's happening.
Ashish, can I just intervene here? Are we still on the first slide? That is the, or are we moving?
Oh, no, we've been moving. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not moving?
No, it's not.
Oh,
so
sorry. Let me go through it again. I don't know what this is. So I've never used the Google course, so I don't know what's happening.
No, I think it's easy.
So I can see the sharing, but I don't.
You change the slide in the computer.
No, I am changing. I've been changing all along. Can you see the second slide now? No?
No,
No,
it's
it
still the
is.
first one.
Okay, so let me stop sharing and try it again. It says present now,
Yeah, that's the only way.
window. When I click on the window and I say share,
Yes, we can see this.
can you see the second slide now? Third
No,
one?
the first.
Still only the first one.
Uh,
Sorry, I don't know what's happening.
so could you make it like a slide share, something like that? This is the icon that you can.
Yeah,
Now
now
we
we
can
can.
see.
Now it's there. It's there.
Yeah,
But you're
Yeah.
seeing only the
This is the second one.
small screen, no?
it's the second slide we're seeing.
But are you
Yeah,
seeing it full or small?
cool. It's okay. It's fine.
Okay, all right. Sorry, because I was doing slide share and I don't know why it wasn't moving
Can
on
we
your
just see
side.
the third
But
slide just to be
yeah,
sure that,
Ah,
yeah,
it
now
is
it's fine.
visible.
okay, so I'll just go down like this.
Fine.
Can you read the
Ah,
text?
yes, yes, yes. It's perfectly all right. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So sorry about that. I didn't realize. Anyway, so let me not go through all of that again. It will be boring. But basically, this was I was talking about how we should look at Gandhi like any other historical figure as a human being with all his imperfections, but also all his greatness. And the context of the model of development, which I spoke about, which is, as I said, a form of violence against both the rest of nature and communities, and how that process of development has actually created enormous amounts of or increased the kind of inequality that we see between peoples within a country like India and of course across the globe. And we also see that despite record growth rates across the world, we have enormous levels of deprivation, or possibly something like two-thirds of India's population from basic needs, including for a very large population, just access to basic, nutritious, adequate food. And these are recent, the Frontline article actually is a very recent study by the National Sample Survey, which showed how nutrition levels, especially of rural populations, have actually become much worse than they were maybe 20 to 30 years back. We also see how in COVID times, this is becoming worse, where the state is becoming more authoritarian, using COVID as an excuse for clamping down on civil rights, doing more state surveillance and so on. And private corporations are using it as a time to significantly increase their profits. As you see here, I think the top 10 billionaires of the world have got $583 billion richer in just these last 5-6 months. We also see how Gandhi is used in so many different ways for perpetuating this kind of system. So what is called Self-Reliant India or Atmanirbhar Bharat is, to my mind, not anywhere near the kind of self-reliance that Gandhi spoke about, because in fact it's significantly enhancing privatization, it's increasing coal mining and many other kinds of activities that are going to further undermine any kind of self-reliance of local communities that I'll speak about later. And so in this sense, we're actually assassinating Gandhi every day. We've been doing that for ever since he was physically assassinated, whether it's with government policies in terms of industrialization and so on, or it's with the kind of domination of one religion over the other, or in many other ways where in fact we are stealing the autonomy of communities and regions of India that we should be respecting much more. And so I wanted to show this lovely cartoon from Lakshman, where he says that if Gandhi comes back alive at some point and walks down any of the MG roads, these are the spots across, whether it's Bangalore or Pune or wherever, where the full scale of economic globalization can be seen, all the big brands across the world, and he would be utterly confused as to what's happening. Yet, on the other hand, this is, I think, where I'd got, Gandhi also still lives. He lives in terms of his ideas, his ideals, his actions, which still continue to inspire millions and millions of people across the world. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now in the rest of the presentation, looking at how and what kind of inspiration, how his ideas are still alive. The three that I'll speak about most, or two actually, Satyagraha and Swaraj, and a little bit on Sarvodaya, but mostly Satyagraha and I think mostly in fact Swaraj, because that's what relates to self-reliance. With Satyagraha, I think very, very important that we understand this concept. I'm sure most of you have done or read Gandhi would know this already, is about speaking truth to power. But it's actually also speaking truth to even those around you, and speaking truth with in a way that is not like creating enemies, but trying to actually change hearts. And I think this is extremely important in today's world where we see such incredible levels of injustice. For instance, even the very shocking incident that's happened in UP just yesterday, this morning. We don't have an option but to speak out and speak truth to power. Now, of course, many of us might be scared because all kinds of things are happening to colleagues of ours who are speaking out and who are being charged with all kinds of with sedition and so on and so terrorism and so on and so forth. But I think we really have to speak. But we also see a large number of movements through India's history in the since independence, where the idea of Satyagraha has been taken, and of course of non-violence has been taken forward in very, very grounded ways. So if you take Chipko movement, which we first got in touch with in the late 1970s, or you take the Narmada movement, they're all explicitly, while they're dissenting from the state, while they're protesting government policies, they're all explicitly non-violent. And in many different ways, they are actually speaking truth to power. This is a movement from about 30 years back in which the Gandhian Baba Ante was also involved, where Adivasis protested against two mega dams that would have displaced them and destroyed their forests. And they were successful. What was very interesting, and again, you see sort of reflections of both Adivasi ideology and Gandhi here, is that the river is considered sacred. It's not meant to produce power. It's a mother. The river is our mother. And in many ways, if you look at what's happened to rivers and forests and coastal areas and mountains and people across the world in the name of development, it's exactly what Gandhiji said, I think 70, 80 years back. When somebody asked him whether India should take the same development path as the UK. And he said, God forbid that India should ever take to industrialism after the manner of the West. If an entire nation of 300 millions, imagine at that time it was 300 millions, we're not talking about 1.3 billion, took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts, which in fact China is doing very well now, and India is also following in its footsteps. The West has already tried to strip the world bare. We also see inspiration of Satyagraha, non-violent Satyagraha in so many different ways across the world, whether it's with the anti-apartheid movement, the Black Freedom movement, even now with the Black Lives Matter movement, anti-racism movements in the US, or climate movements by the youth, such as Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, all in some way or the other, explicitly or implicitly, talking about non-violence and the inspiration of Gandhi as part of their strategies. Let me move to Swaraj, and I think it's very important for us to understand, most of you would know this, but for those who don't, is that Swaraj kind of got equated to India's independence from the British colonial rule. And of course it was that. But it is a much more deeper and a much older concept, probably 1,000 years old or more, which Gandhi brought back. And when he brought it back, he was actually talking about it in a very deep and wide way as a combination of Sangharsh and Nirman, which is to say you resist, but also you reconstruct. And I'll be talking about some of the reconstruction in a minute. You talk about my freedom and my community's freedom or my country's freedom, but in responsibility to your freedom. This is so important because otherwise it seems like the American notion of freedom, which is I will run my SUV wherever I want and I will take my fuel and petrol from anywhere I want. But in fact, Swaraj is saying that whatever I do, I cannot undermine your freedom and your autonomy. And I would extend that, and I call that eco-Swaraj later on, to actually say your as in not just you as a human being, but also you as the rest of nature. So other species also and their freedoms cannot be undermined in my pursuit of freedom and autonomy. And also then, of course, how deeply political the personal is, which is what Gandhi's life was such an important message, that you live your ideals, you try and practice what you're preaching in your personal life as much as your professional life. And so let me move to some examples of where people have tried to actually achieve this on the ground. So here, this is one of the most inspiring examples for me. I've been associated with this for the last almost 25 years now. About 5,000 Dalit and Adivasi women farmers in Telangana who 30 years back were facing hunger, deprivation, poverty, inequality, injustice, untouchability, everything that Dalit communities in India face, but as women even more so in a system of patriarchy. And in the last 30 years, they have mobilized themselves by forming women's Mahila Sanghams, women's committees in each of the about 75 villages, brought back their traditional varieties of seeds, switched completely to organic cultivation, switched a lot more to collective farming, to exchanging seeds with each other, creating grain banks in each village, sharing credit, etc. And claiming full rights, women's rights to the land, and then saying that what we're trying to do is to move towards not just food security, which is what, say, the right to food movement in India has been arguing for, but food sovereignty. And I think this is so very important. The difference between security, which could be Suraksha, and sovereignty, which is Swaraj. And so they call it Anna Swaraj, which means full control over seeds, land, water, knowledge, and everything else to do with the production of food. Now, very interestingly, over these last 30 years, they have achieved this to such a good extent that in the current COVID crisis, firstly, there's not a single COVID case in any of their villages. Secondly, they are actually feeding those who don't have adequate food in the district, and health workers and municipality workers and police workers with the produce that they have from their lands. A second example is from the Northeast. Let me just check again. The slides are working, right?
Yes. Yes, slides are working perfectly.
Okay, so the
Yes.
second example is from Northeast India. This is a network of women called Northeast Network, which works in Nagaland and a couple of other states in the Northeast. And here in Nagaland, they have facilitated the continuation or the revival of the enormously sophisticated agricultural systems that have been practiced there, both settled agriculture and shifting cultivation. And in the current COVID times, again, because of the fact that they have a lot of these systems still intact, people did not suffer the kind of food insecurity that others in the country have faced. And they were able to create a system by which the food could also reach the market to, say, for instance, in Kohima, by working with the state administration, so that farmers were not losing out on livelihoods, as again has happened in so many other parts of the country. What's also very interesting is a lot of young people have gone back because they no longer have jobs in cities and industrial areas, and they've gone back to the villages. And at least some of them are saying, maybe we should just stay back and see whether we can actually also take part in the local activities. And this is a big challenge right now, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The third example I'd like to take is something that has been even more badly marginalized in India's development policies, and that is India's pastoral populations, especially the nomadic pastoralists. This, for instance, are Maldharis in Kutch, who have either buffaloes or sheep and goats or camels. And they have been moving back and forth in that landscape for centuries and sustaining the landscape in an ecological way and sustaining their livelihoods. Now, again, if you look at the current situation, they had problems in terms of, for instance, being able to sell the milk in the nearby market. But they were otherwise self-sufficient. And then they worked with some of the local NGOs and in some cases the district administration to make sure that the livelihoods were sustained in this period. But their big demand for a long, long time has been, we want collective rights to the landscapes in which we do our traditional grazing practices, which unfortunately the state government has been giving up for industries and all kinds of other purposes in the last few decades. I move now to another very crucial aspect of Swaraj and sovereignty, including food sovereignty, which is like the Maldharis, Adivasis in central India have also been arguing that the only way we can secure our livelihoods and lives is by having full control over the lands and the forests that we live amidst. And so this is a movement in Gadchiroli district in Maharashtra. 90 villages have got together to form a Mahagram Sabha. And their main argument is we don't want any mining here because it destroys our livelihoods, but also we want to create a much more egalitarian, much more equal system of decision making in which the women also have a equal part, and to assert our own Adivasi identities. And this is again something that's very interesting because Gandhi, long ago, when he spoke about culture, and I'll quote that right at the end in my last slide, spoke about how we need to be rooted in our cultures, but we should not be afraid to learn from outside. And again, this set of villages is saying that we will root ourselves in Adivasi cultures, but that doesn't mean we're not going to learn the ABCs and the mathematics and so on. Our schools will also have that. So how do we create a hybrid system in which we don't get completely swept aside, retain our pride, our identity, but also our learning from the outside and being able to deal with the external world? This Mahagram Sabha itself is partly inspired by a village in which a Gandhian worker has also been working on by Hirabai Hiralal for a long time, which declared self-rule 30 years back. हम दिल्ली में हमारी सरकार, हमारे गांव में हम ही सरकार. So we elect the government in Delhi, but in our village we are the government. That's true democracy, actually, if you look at it, where people are saying everything to do with the village will be decided by the Gram Sabha, not by a bureaucrat, not by a sarpanch or a pramukh, not by a politician, but by the entire Gram Sabha, by consensus. And 3 or 4 years back, they did this most amazing decision, took the most amazing decision of donating entire village land, including all the private agricultural land, into the village commons. So there's no private property in that village anymore. And this is a very important principle also of Gandhian economics. You can see this with crafts. So this is an organization that is actually currently facing a severe crisis for many reasons, including the fact that especially the fact that state and central governments have simply not paid their dues to this organization that employs, I think, 150 to 200 women who are doing hand spinning, hand weaving, etc. And so when GST was imposed on crafts and including on handloom, they did a Satyagraha. And right now, because of this non-payment of dues, they're actually having to shut down. They had to shut down a month back. They're doing another whole kind of Satyagraha, including trying to reopen by creating their own consumer base rather than depend on the government. So this is another huge aspect of it. Of course, Gandhi, with his charkha, was the most important symbol of Swaraj and self-reliance. And these are initiatives that are trying to actually bring that back in real life to show how that can make people self-reliant. Speaking about economy, one of the biggest problems across the world, including in India, is the control of the economy in the hands of either the state or capitalist corporations, capitalists. And here again, you can see interesting examples where there are workers who are running their own companies on the basis of completely equal dividends to each member, and putting the profits not back into capitalist expansion, but actually putting back into their own operations and making sure that other elements of what the communities need are met. And this is one example from Andhra Pradesh. Recently, we had a webinar. We've been doing a whole series of webinars of these examples from around India. We had one with this village called Kunaria in Kutch, where the Sarpanch Suresh Changa and a number of the Panch members, such as Miraben there, they have actually been mobilizing the whole village to do its own planning. In COVID times, they immediately actually took the kind of health measures that were necessary for the village without even waiting for the government to do it, and empowering themselves in many other ways. And a very interesting thing that Suresh Bhai told us in the webinar was, he said in the last few months, we've realized that we are spending 40 lakh rupees per month on daily items of use, footwear, soaps, detergents, etc., etc. These days everything is produced by a company and we buy it. And he says, why can't we as a cluster of villages actually produce all of this ourselves? And so again, these are ways by which people are trying to move towards the notion of self-reliance. And if you look at, for instance, places like Kutambakkam, where Dalit Sarpanch called Ilango, his idea was what he called network economy. 20 villages getting together and producing all the basic needs. So you don't have any dependence on corporations outside. Ela Bhatt recently wrote a book called Anubandh, which has a similar concept for a 100-mile radius. You see examples in Maharashtra where, because of this kind of revitalization that's happened in a number of villages, you no longer have distress migration out of the villages, but in fact, there are examples where people have come back to the village, having gone to the city or the industrial area. Again, those are real examples of moving towards self-reliance. But it's not just in villages. One can do that even in cities. So here's an example from Bhuj, where several colonies have been enabled to mobilize themselves with the help of some local NGOs to do much more planning for themselves, create water self-sufficiency, build their own housing, dignified housing, move towards complete waste management, etc., etc. And their assertion is that even in a city, as citizens, we need to be in control. We can't leave it to corporators and to bureaucrats and so on to plan our lives. We should be in control of our lives. So, and then finally, of course, in terms of a couple of other quick points, and then I'll come to a bit of a framework. Gandhi was very, very insistent also on Swaraj for one's own health, or self-reliance for one's own health. That's why, for instance, he had all kinds of experiments on treating himself through naturopathy. And in Pune, we have the National Institute of Naturopathy, which is trying to promote those ideas. But it's not just about self, it's also about building community health systems. So I gave the example of Kunaria. There are many other examples where, because the community health system was very strong, they were able to deal with the COVID crisis much better compared to others who had become completely dependent on governments or on private institutions, where the health systems in many cases just collapsed. And of course, this is also really about deep spiritual learning, going within oneself, etc. And as you see in that little cartoon there, modernization has also meant that many of us are basically sitting at our desks and doing soul-deadening jobs. You can see this in so many fields. You can see this in architecture, where many examples in the country of organizations that have tried to pick up those kinds of ideas from Gandhi, from Kumarappa, etc., and say, how can we actually do architecture which is also in our own control, which is suited to the local environment, which is cheap, which uses local materials, etc. Now, here's some examples of that. Quickly, the third concept of Sarvodaya, everybody is familiar with this, but I think it's very important again in this COVID crisis time of looking at how our economy needs to be radically transformed to remove the kind of vulnerability and marginalization of whether it's migrant labor or it's casual workers or whatever, and especially amongst those of Dalits, women, sex workers, and so on. And so therefore the movements towards also rights-based legislation, or movements to actually achieve the fundamental rights that are guaranteed to us in the Constitution and even beyond that, such as what the MKSS has done in not just Rajasthan, but nationally with the right to information and much else. Quickly, to give you a few examples from outside India. So firstly, I don't know how many of the students here will think of this as an upside down map. I think it's very important that we examine the history of everything that we use, including language, of course. The map we're used to, which all of us are still using, is actually a colonial time map in which Europe was shown to be on top, and it was shown to be much bigger than it actually is. Here, what you see is the actual sizes of the continents, and you can see that England actually almost totally disappears. But the other reason is just to give you some examples of similar movements at autonomy, self-reliance, freedom, etc. in different parts of the world. I'll just give you a couple of examples quickly. I was lucky to be here about a year back in the Amazon, where indigenous peoples have been fighting for self-determination for a long, long, long time. And some countries, they have managed to secure that. but still threatened by oil mining or other kinds of extractive activities. And so here the Sapara nation, they call themselves the nation, is trying to protect its entire habitat by also creating hybrid systems of self-reliance, which is their own uses of forests and so on, but also some level of community-based ecotourism in which outsiders can come and experience the spiritual depths and the physical living and biological aspects of their lives. The second example is an extremely inspiring one for me, and this is a very interesting one from a Gandhian perspective, because this attempt by the Kurdish people in the midst of possibly the world's most war-torn area, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, is an attempt to create a zone of eco-feminist peace and ecological living, direct democracy, and so on, but they also have their own army. And it's a very interesting thing. I spoke to a couple of the women leaders there, and I asked them, but how do you have a belief in fundamentally in peace, but then you also have your own army? And their explanation was very simple. They said that if we don't have the army, we'll get completely wiped out by Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So it's basically self-defense, but we are working towards a system in which, in fact, if war is eradicated from this area and conflicts are eradicated, we don't need the army anymore. I think it will be a fascinating, I've been wanting to do it, it'll be a fascinating conversation between Gandhi and the Kurdish women's movement to look at the concepts of violence and non-violence. Because actually even Gandhi did say that violence is preferable to cowardly non-violence. And so the point I made right at the beginning, I think it's very important. If you look at a lot of these movements, they're not necessarily only Gandhian or only Marxist or only Ambedkarite or only ecologist or only feminist. They cut across a lot of what we as intellectuals and academics make these kind of divides. And this picture that I took, I have not arranged it. This is from the Gandhi Ashram in Wardha, the bookshop there, which had Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Subhash Chandra Bose's books all together on the same table. Maybe that's a nice symbolic way. Okay, the last 5 minutes I want to spend on looking at what kind of principles are sort of emerging from all these different movements, which are linked to what Gandhi said and did. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to give you what I think is 5 crucial spheres of transformation in lives towards more justice and more ecological sustainability and food sovereignty and so on. Number 1, top right-hand side, that democracy is not about going to elections. It's about claiming power where we are, but claiming power and autonomy in a way that is responsible to others' autonomy also. This is very, very important. And if we actually take that to the further extent, we start questioning current nation-state boundaries also. I hope I don't get charged with sedition for saying this, but South Asia's boundaries, for instance, don't make much ecological or cultural sense. We've cut across regions where wildlife used to go back and forth, people used to go back and forth, nomadic communities used to go back and forth, and we have to start rethinking that. The second crucial transformation is in the economy, and there, and probably Mark can add much more on this. If you look at Gandhian Economics, which Kumarappa took forward, which of course nobody listened to, unfortunately, post-independence, it's really about bringing back caring and sharing in the economy. It's bringing back relations of reciprocity and interconnection, connectedness and so on, and local sovereignty over basic needs. The third is social justice, because we see what's happening, for instance, in UP right now or elsewhere. You can have localization of power, but then that can be enormously discriminatory or exploitative of women, of Dalits, and so on. So you also need the struggles for social justice and equality and Sarvodaya and so on. The fourth is culture and knowledge diversity, which is so important because we have seen across the world the domination of modern Western systems of knowing and being and understanding. Whereas as we see with the movements I spoke about, there's actually an enormous diversity of knowledge systems and cultures that we have to respect. And the fifth one, of course, is sustaining the earth. Because if we don't sustain the earth, we're all going to die anyway, as we can see with what's happening with the climate crisis across the world, or with pollution, or with forest fires, and so on. And so this is my most important slide. If you see all these different movements and the fundamentals of the Gandhian way of thinking and being and doing, it's really about living ethics, principles, and values. And I don't have the time to go into all of these, of course, but you will have seen glimpses of one or more of these in the examples that I gave you. For instance, if you take the examples, they're about cooperation and not competition. They're about the commons and not about privatization. Or if you take governance, it's not about electoral politics, but really about claiming power where we are, as I said several times. If it's about the economy, it's really about self-reliance, at least for the basic needs of food and water and shelter and so on. If it's about rights, yes, human rights, but also the rights of the rest of nature, etc. So I think this is, to me, the most important learning I have had from all these different movements across the world, that what kind of ethics can we rely on. And so moving towards what the Atmanirbhar Bharat package should actually have had is a support of this kind of self-reliance, Swaraj, etc. We could create and can still create 400 million, 500 million dignified livelihoods based on these kinds of models across all the sectors, not just agriculture and forestry, but also crafts and small-scale manufacturing, also services. All of it can be, most of it can be decentralized. We also need to then recognize sovereignty of communities and own decision makings, social justice, and very importantly, the regeneration of nature. There's a lot more available on this in some of the books that I've been privileged enough to help edit or author. The one in the middle is the one that was spoken about right at the beginning, which is 100 examples from around the earth, around the world, on this kind of alternatives. The one, Alternative Futures, India Unshackled, is 35 essays from 40, 50 different very experienced people on the future of India, say 20 years or 30 years or 50 years from now, and how we can get there. And this Ecologies of Hope is 9 case studies, very detailed case studies of how communities have done this kind of transformation. We're trying to bring a lot of this kind of stuff together through this Vikalp Sangam process, which when I was introduced was spoken about. And I very much welcome all of you to participate in this. These are physical confluences when it's possible, of people coming together for 3, 4, 5 days and having fun, talking serious stuff, doing practical activities, etc. And all these different topics that you see in this image. And also a lot more documentation of the kinds of examples around the grant. I'll give you a website later on, which to my mind is very important. It has 1,500, 1,600 stories of transformation around the world. Now, young people have in many different ways been engaging with, and in many ways also taking a lead in this. If you go back to the 70s or 60s and 70s, the Chhatra Yuva Sangharsh Vahini was where a lot of young people got involved with Jayaprakash Narayan as a preeminent Gandhian. And it's many of the examples I gave you are actually people who were at that time young, got inspired through this, and then went and settled in a village or worked in a town and helped to create these kind of transformations. And so the question we would ask ourselves, whether it's social work or any such profession, is what we are doing helping to empower the most marginalized? Is it enhancing happiness of people, our own, but also everybody else? Is it ecologically sensitive? Does it learn from communities' own knowledge systems and practice and so on, and build on that? And many others. I'm sure these are just a small set of questions that we have. And I think, again, young people have an incredibly important role. And I think those of us who are now getting along in age should be taking a back step and learning from what the youth are doing. I see, for instance, with the climate crisis, how young people have taken a lead across the world to demand from the elders action to save the earth in so many different ways. And India is one of the world's, I think it is the world's most youthful population, age-wise. And so therefore, I think that's where the real hope lies in transformation. And I will end with Gandhi's quote. This is from Sabarmati Ashram. I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all the lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any of them. It shows a rootedness, but an openness. And I think that is the most important message from Gandhi for us. Thank you very much. I'll I'll stop sharing. This slideshow is available to anybody to use. I will send it to you or give you a link, and please feel free to use it. There's no copyright on the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah, it's
I
a
would be happy.
world of
I would
experience.
be happy if you just call me Ashish. The sir business also has to be.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ashish. We got a world of experience from India and world, and also we also heard, take a note of the questions you spoke about towards the end. So the experience that you shared, they are very important. The questions that you put, these are very important. These are going to be dealt with our faculty member, Dr. Malti Madam. So over to Malti Madam to moderate it.
Okay, first of all, thanks Ashish. It was really wonderful and insightful because it just gives us a lot of strength actually to go about. But we have certain questions, and I'll start with one of our participant, Jatin. He seems to have a question which is related with some kind of a mythological character that Gandhi got impressed with, and when he saw a play on his life. Would you like to take that question, or shall we skip that one?
Which mythological character is this?
Impressed Gandhi for life when he saw a play on his life. We are not doing a what you call, something on.
Which mythological character impressed Gandhiji for life when he saw a play on his life? Good question. I don't know. You can tell me, Jatin. This is a nice quiz question.
What Shravan Kumar is interested in knowing what is the socio-psychological effect of Swaraj.
Okay, that's very important, I think, because the way Gandhi meant it and the way a lot of these movements are also trying to get there is to say that Swaraj is deeply, it is community politics, it's community economics, but also it's also deeply personal, as I tried to mention. And so in that sense, if I have an adequate voice in my community, or I have an adequate voice in decisions that affect my life, to me, that's deeply satisfying. And I think that would be true for most or all human beings. In fact, some people say that basic needs are not just about our physiological and biological and those sorts of things, but basic needs are also about, do I have a voice? Do I have good social relationships? Do I have access to healthcare and so on? And in that sense, the ability to be part of deciding my own present and future life is deeply psychologically very satisfying. So,
Ji, please mute Mr. M.T. Shanmugamas. Yeah, could you mute him?
So in that sense, I think socially and psychologically, Swaraj has a very, very crucial role to play. And that's why, again, Gandhi kept talking about the spiritual. And to me, I think the spiritual is so much more important than saying religious, because spiritual is really about, it's actually the root of all religions, but unfortunately, religions also then tend to become dogmatic and monolithic and so on. So whereas spiritualism is really something that's deeply rooted in us as a human being and in our collective lives. And a lot of indigenous peoples around the world actually have more or less the same, they won't call it the same thing, but they have more or less the same kind of way of thinking of themselves as individuals within communities, and community including the rest of nature. Like the Sapara nation that I spoke about, they believe that they are just one of thousands of entities in the landscape. The rocks, the river, the forest, the trees, the animals, everything has its own spirit. And I am only one of those spirits, and I live as a family, as part of a family, a much larger family. And in that sense, that's also a very deep notion of Swaraj.
There is some question which is related with understanding the trusteeship, relationship between trusteeship and Swaraj.
Yeah, I think the notion of trusteeship, again, I would defer to others who have a better understanding of this. It tends to be somewhat controversial, because he was also speaking about how capitalists should be trustees, in the sense that they should be behaving responsibly towards, instead of using their money for all their private pleasures and so on, they should be using it for the good of the poor. But to me, trusteeship actually goes well beyond that, to also think of how each one of us and us as a human species is not an owner of anything else. I don't own you. Men don't own women. And similarly, humans don't own the rest of nature. But we are a trustee, we're a custodian. If it is in our power to do something that damages, we should be responsible and make sure that in fact that damage does not take place. So I would think of trusteeship in that, if you combine it with Swaraj and Sarvodaya and so on, in that much more sort of wider and deeper sense of uh, being responsible custodians, just like as parents we are responsible custodians of our children, or like the Mendhalekha village, which is now saying that we are a custodian of the land, we are not the owner of the land anymore as individuals. That is how I would look at trusteeship.
There is one question from Professor Archana Dasi. She wants to know, when both rural and urban economies have suffered a setback, how would Gandhian approach help the Indian society to bounce back?
I think, in fact, it is the most important approach to bounce back. Like I tried indicating at the end, and of course I did it very fast. If we were putting, let's say, 20,000 crores of rupees or whatever amount has been put, not much more, sorry, 2 lakh crores of rupees into the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, that whole package should have been oriented towards enabling the kind of examples that I gave. So, for instance, reviving or sustaining the lives that depend on agriculture, on crafts, on small-scale manufacturing, creating areas of self-reliance across the country, making sure that workers who've gone back to their village, millions of workers have gone back to their villages, actually are able to stay on and have the kind of livelihoods that I spoke about. This is not rocket science, it's not impossible, it's all possible, but it means a reprioritization of the resources away from centralized industry and big banks and so on and so forth to every single community, village and town community in the country who needs to be supported to move towards becoming like Mendhalekha, or becoming like the Deccan Development Society women, or becoming like the Northeast Network or whatever. It's not, this is not theory. It's all, I mean, the practice is already available to us. So it's really about learning from it and extending it. The big question, of course, is the government really interested? And that's where there are serious doubts.
There are some questions which are connected with this concept of non-violence. What one Laksha is talking about is Gandhi's non-violent approach actually has certain elements of violence. What he says is that in terms of disruption of communication and destruction of property, etc., in terms of the civil disobedience, defending it as a leonial violence in that regard. So how this philosophy of ahimsa can actually be non-violent?
Yeah, I think, I think that's a very good question. So when, for instance, the cloth burning, the burning the cloth from UK mills, kind of thing happened. Again, maybe somebody like Mark can tell us more about that. But to my mind, the notion of ahimsa, which was both absolute but also relative. And in this sense, for instance, he also said at some point, I'm paraphrasing here, that if you're acting violently as self-defense, that is much better than cowardice. And to him, not taking action on the kind of violence that was being meted out to India's weavers and textile producers and so on, because of what the British government was doing, was a form of violence against which you needed a self-defense. And that self-defense could not possibly have been to kill the British or to kill the textile manufacturers in UK. In fact, when he went to England, he went and met them specifically because he said, I know that I'm affecting your livelihoods, and therefore I've come to meet you. And they actually greeted him as a hero. So I'm taking action on material objects, and that also is something that he probably would not have in an ordinary sense condoned, but it was something that was trying to stave off and create a situation of non-violence in the midst of enormous violence that was being perpetuated by the colonial rule. So yes, you can think of, it's similar to actually what I spoke about the Kurdish movement. The Kurdish women's movement very deeply believes in ecofeminism and peace and ecology and so on, but they also maintain an army. And for them, if they didn't do that, they would be wiped out. And the same thing would happen in India if you don't actually struggle against the British. In that sense, we would be still under subjugation of a foreign rule, and our handlooms would have been completely wiped out. It's a completely different matter, and he did predict this, that independent India has also, unfortunately, been extremely, what should I say, subjugating as far as handmade and handloom and so on is concerned, but nothing compared to what the British were.
Then, related to this question of non-violence, there's a question from Asif, which is asking whether Gandhi's call for ahimsa in contemporary times is relevant when, how do you look at it when perpetrating violence has become the new normal, just the one that you just spoke about?
I think actually it's even more relevant in today's time because trying to hit back, I mean, supposing it's, for instance, what's happening in the name of Hindutva or the kind of atrocities against Dalits or whatever that's happening. If the response is violence, then it's only doing what Gandhi said long back, that if it's an eye for an eye, then we're all going to turn blind. And so I think non-violent resistance, but it has to be collective resistance, and it has to be based on fundamental principles, which are not so easy in today's world. But if you took, for instance, Shaheen Bagh, or you take the sort of movement against the Citizens Amendment Act and NRC and so on, I think those are brilliant examples of where non-violence has been used. It so happened that because of COVID, they had to actually withdraw a lot of those sit-ins, but for the several, many days that it was held, it was explicitly non-violent. It was also explicitly multi-faith, multi-religious, multi-community. And in fact, the state didn't quite know how to deal with it. That's exactly what Gandhi said. If you use the same weapons that the state is using against you, they always have more power. But if you completely flip it around and use tactics that they don't understand, then you have a better chance of being able to both not defeat, but actually win over the enemy. Now, I know, of course, this is a very difficult concept right now, because how does one win over I don't know, 4 men who go and do gang rape of a woman? It's obviously very difficult to even conceive of. But it's a long-term kind of thing where we say that it's not just about women's rights. It's also about empowering men to actually be full human beings. Most of us, as we grow up, I'm talking as a man here, as we grow up, we kind of get trained into being masculinist and patriarchal. And in a way, that's even limiting my own freedoms, right? So this thing of how we deal with it is also over 2 or 3, 4 generations, is to talk about non-violent ways of dealing with each other, equal ways of dealing with each other, and concept of sarvada and so on. So that's how I would say it. I mean, there's no immediate answer to this. There's no shortcut to it. We can't overnight say, okay, non-violence is going to solve all the problems. But I don't see any other way of doing it. It's just that it's a long-term solution.
Ashish, there is one question by Mrityunjay saying, this is, look, we have got examples from you with regard to very, very local initiatives. So there is one, that question is talking about what are the kind of strategies for promoting commons and community and cooperative living at the macro and the micro level?
Yeah,
so
I
maybe
think that's very important. I think in the near future, I think one way to do it is to argue for policies that support these kinds of initiatives. For instance, when I gave the example of the Dalit women farmers of Telangana, they have also for the last 20 years been fighting for or demanding policies on millets. So they're saying, why in the public distribution system or in the midday meals or whatever, are you only promoting wheat and rice? And that also what comes from UP and Punjab and so on. Why don't you promote the local cereals or local food grains or whatever is available, including millets, which actually have been the staple food for half of India for a long time. And they then argued for a millet policy they actually created a national network called Mini Millet Network of India and argued for a national policy to put millets into the PDS, the public distribution system, which now some states have done. And the central government also kind of made some statement about it. They haven't got to it yet, but many states are now moving towards doing that. So what that would do is that would significantly expand the purchase of millets, which means it would encourage farmers to go into millet. And most millet farming actually is and can be organic and very low water consumption. So I think that's the kind of, in a short-term sense, that's the kind of, immediate sense, that's the kind of thing. But in the long run, one will have to argue for a reduction in the interventions of the state and, of course, doing away with private capitalist corporations, where communities become more and more self-reliant, such as what the Dalit women farmers have done.
Yeah, Ashish, I think we would like to have Professor R.R. Singh. I think he would like to speak something, and he's trying to do that. So, Professor R.R. Singh, please, you're welcome to pose your question, but you have to unmute yourself. Please take some assistance and unmute, please. Yeah, please.
I didn't want to speak. I came to hear, and that is very fascinating. So let the questions be over. At the end, if there is time, I will speak a few words.
No, we would like to hear from you, because we have been guided by you and to doing this kind of seminar.
Then
yes,
I have not participated in any movement, but I have, for instance, Narmada Bachao or Chipko contributions and token presence. I think that has been my experience. Sundarlal Bahguna had been invited by me to speak to Department of Social Work faculty and students. He spent the night, and when I said, "What do you like to eat?" he said, "Avoid rice and potato because that consumes more water." Something I saw in Pani Panchayat area, they don't call themselves Gandhian, but water rights were equally distributed. There has been degeneration, that is another. As I have practiced resistance, because when people ask, is Gandhi relevant? Do you want to try or do you want an answer? So when you try, then only you know what is the outcome. Leave it, but don't ask this question, because journals, books, lectures everywhere. Pandurang Hegde, our own alumnus, went for block placement in Chipko region and created a similar model in Kerala's Silent Valley. Nagaland, I want to leave out because I have lived there for 3 years. But resistance, I have practiced in the Department of Social Work and Tata Institute of Social Sciences. When unfair demands were being made, and someone said, "Do you want to be immortal?" I said, "If you want to make it so," because I am mortal. So Galtung's book, Johann Galtung, Peace is the Way. This is the title of the book, and just as the speaker has given the scenario, he has given a global scenario that how we should get into that world. I think I should stop here. I would like to hear others.
Thank you, Professor R.R. Singh.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks a lot. So let me see if there are other questions. Someone is asking about titles of the book, and I think we could look at Vikalp Sangam and also the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, where we will get all the references. I think
I'm typing some out in the chat. So
yeah, and Ashish also has his own blog. I think that's very interesting to read on the blog, which is about Atmanirbhar Bharat, a conversation between our present Prime Minister and Mahatma Gandhi. That was a very interesting read. Then any other? Let me just look into it. Professor Ushwinder Popley. Again, of course, this thing has been talked about by Ashish about what happened to our daughter at Hathras. More so, the way administration got rid of her, etc. So, what would Gandhiji say to it, according to her?
I mean, like all of us, he would be deeply distressed. But probably, unlike us, he would have the courage to go out and do something about it, whether to go on fast or go there and meet the family and be with them and stay with them and express his Satyagraha through various different ways to do that. Unfortunately, we're all stuck in COVID, or we're using COVID as an excuse to get stuck. And so the kind of solidarity that we should or could have been expressing for her family especially, and the community, is not able to be expressed. Yeah, I mean, I think he would have, but he would, unfortunately, the situation is that he would probably have been on fast for the last many years. Given, I mean, this is the latest shocking incident, but there's been all kinds of policies and programs and so much that has been done, including, like I said, the so-called Atmanirbhar Bharat package, that he would have found deeply distressing. And he would have brought global attention to it. Unfortunately, in India, we don't have now those kind of individuals or collectives that have the sheer moral strength to be able to be out on the street and get the global attention that is required, or catch the hearts of people in the way that Gandhi could, so that there would be millions of people coming out and saying this is just absolutely wrong.
One last from Bitopi Datta, and I think I'll close the what you call taking questions more, which is with regard to if we are trapped between Western ideas of nationalism and Indian reality, which does not necessarily fit into Western imaginations of state. How do we reimagine Gandhi?
I think Gandhi and probably even more so Tagore had very interesting ideas of what nationalism could be. It definitely was not what the current government is propagating as nationalism. And in fact, if you look at it, both of them and many others were even deeply suspicious of the state itself, of a centralized state. Gandhi at some point said the state is the enemy of the people. And so any form of nationalism which becomes jingoistic, which says that we are a nation against other nations, and also turns on its own people, when they ask questions of the government, they say you're anti-national, is definitely something that's as far removed from Gandhian and Tagore's concept of nationalism. So again, this is something that I'm sure he would have protested against in his own unique way. In many ways, yeah. we have to re-examine nationalism. We have to do so. For instance, the notion of nation by itself is not necessarily problematic. As I mentioned to you, the Kakara indigenous people and actually most indigenous peoples in Latin America and North America call themselves nations. But they don't think of themselves as nation states that are opposed to the neighboring nation states and where we will, not see our resources flow to. I mean, for instance, India does not want Ganga to flow into Bangladesh or Indus to flow into Pakistan. And to me, those notions of nationalism are deeply flawed. They have to be fundamental. And nationalism should be about our civilization, thousands of years of civilization, which is diverse, which is deeply respectful of each other and of the rest of nature, and so on. That is what I would think of as nationalism.
I think I'll complete now, and I will hand over the space to now Pratap ji and Ashish ji. Thanks a lot for giving us the space and helping us to understand, clarify, etc. So now,
ma'am, I have a question. If you could pass it on to.
Please. No, you can ask directly now since you are there. Why me? There is some disturbance though. Please check.
Yeah.
We can request everyone to just mute themselves. I think then
it appears that Professor Ara Singh also wants to say one or two words.
Yes, sir.
We'll ask
Two anecdotes are footnotes. Gandhi followed his principles without groups and masses supporting him. Ekla chalo re. So, as far as leadership is concerned, you have to see that if people fail or they don't agree with you, I move alone. I mean, this is one. And second, the reimagining or reimaging, that requires action, and otherwise it will be imagination. There is no focus. Once you, again, this question is like relevance question. Keep imagining what comes out of that imagination. Because Gandhi was imaginative, and earlier speaker, not last one,
The
last
Akhil
series, he had
Akhil
mentioned
Bilgram.
about it. Because leadership now, when it is collective, it is all right as far as one can go and hold on to the principle. Because the speaker has said absolute and also relative. And in fact, a professor of philosophy in the USA met another senior professor and he asked a question. He was going to drive his car and he said, "What is your question? What is the difference between religion and philosophy?" He said, "Are you an Indian?" He said, "Yes. For you, philosophy and religion are the same. For us, Greece is philosophy and Christianity, that means Middle East, is religion. So for us, it is different. For you, it is the same." I think these are. Gandhi was oceanic. In fact, Gandhi has been psychoanalyzed. 3 of his ashrams were experiments. That is also published. And you compare JP face to face, because JP was mentioned by the speaker, face to face, that means with Naxals in the area. And then he was called back to Nirman movement and others. That small book, that is also there. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important.
Yeah. So it's a question. This question was, from the last talks that came into my mind, but the relevance is right now. So I want to learn from the illustrations that you cited, Mr. Kothari. We talked about cooperation, non-cooperation, these key words in Gandhian thought. So in last, webinar, Professor Belgrami, and also we read in books that non-cooperation, if I do not cooperate in commons, my benefits are immediate. And if I cooperate, my benefits are there, but it could be very late. Now, in your illustrations, we have successful commons stories, practices. So we would learn how an individual changed their mind from non-cooperation to cooperation and seeking a greater benefit in a later time.
Yeah, sure. So I think, the example I'll give you is from Indalekha, where they converted all the private lands into commons. And in fact, they used a legislation that came out of a Gandhian movement, the Bhudan movement, Bhudan movement, then led to this act called the Gramdan Act, which is hardly known in India, though it's 30 years old. But it took them 12 years or 10 or 12 years of discussion in the Gram Sabha to come to that decision. So you can imagine, because every farming family to give up its private ownership of land into the village commons is a very difficult decision. Can you imagine? Every one of us is told that, okay, in your colony, your house doesn't belong to you anymore, it's part of the commons. In fact, there are communities that live like that in different parts of the world. It's a very difficult thing, but they did it over 10, 12 years by talking all the time about what could be the benefits to every person in the family, which would outweigh the benefits of having private property.
Somebody's mic is on, please.
Yes, Professor R.R. Singh only. So,
Oh, I think it's
sir,
Professor
mute
R.R.
it.
Professor
You mute
R.R.
him. ताकि आप म्यूट कर दीजिए सर को नहीं आएगा
What do I do?
नहीं सर कुछ नहीं करिए सर आप कुछ नहीं करिए प्रताप जी कर देंगे प्रताप
हाँ
you
ठीक है ठीक है ठीक है
सर कुछ नहीं करना आपने
नहीं हमारा
ठीक है।
हो गया है
ठीक है सर
ठीक है, so yeah, so they were able to actually say that if we do this, what will happen is much more cooperation amongst all the people in the village to, for instance, exchange seeds, to exchange, share knowledge and things like that. And that's something that you see across society. If you take, whether you take farming or you take even something like in the modern sector like software. So when you have software that is privately controlled, whether it's Microsoft or Apple or whoever, versus you have software that's in the open source domain, things like Linux and all of that, you actually see that there are thousands of people in this part of it who are part of developing and making much better, etc., all the software. And in fact, even these guys, Microsoft and Apple, both have stolen from the open source networks. And you take anything like that. So for instance, seeds. In India, we have traditionally had something like 100,000 varieties of rice. Okay, how did that happen? Nobody had private ownership over it. People were freely exchanging seeds, then they were going to their own village and trying it out, creating a new variety out of that, and so on. And so actually knowledge significantly expands and more innovation takes place. And so therefore, through all of that, people benefit even more. Then if you were to privatize, whether it's land or it's knowledge or software or whatever it is. But this needs, we have all got so ingrained in the Western way of thinking in the last couple of centuries that we're scared of going in that direction. I would be very scared if people in my colony were to say, okay, let's commonize all the resources, which means that once I'm dead and gone, my house will not go to my children. It can go to anybody else. There'll be a line and people will see who has the need and it'll go to that person. And as I said, there are communities that live like that. But it'd be like, oh, no, how can that happen? But imagine if we did that, a huge source of corruption today would actually vanish. Because I am collecting huge amounts of money as a businessman or a politician or whatever it is, not only because I want it, but because I also want to pass it down to my children. Now imagine we passed a law which said no inheritance of private property. First of all, no private property, and then no inheritance of private property. You see dramatic transformations taking place in governance and so on. But it's a difficult one, obviously.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It's really inspiring. Now I would like to invite Professor Pamela Singla Madam to have concluding remarks.
Thank you, Pratap ji, and I think.
Sorry, Pamela ji, just to mention that I'll put my email ID in the chat. So if anybody wants to continue the dialogue or ask me further questions, or if there any question that has got inadvertently left out, my apologies. Please email me and I will respond.
Yeah, very nice.
Thank you very much for that. You've been so kind, Ashish ji, really kind by, taking out time to speak to our students, our faculty, and in fact, friends, I think we had another very powerful speaker in our webinar series, and we feel actually enlightened. Thank you, Ashish ji, for that. And I really do not think there's much to say after having heard such a productive discussion, thanks to Malti and Vera. But a few lines from me. For me, it was actually pleasure to listen to your field experience and the work that has been done in Bhuj, Kutch, Northeast. I think they were the field realities and the attempt towards the local initiatives and their attempt towards self-reliance, self-control, social justice. I think they were very powerful narratives that you just gave, and the students who are here, scholars, I think they would learn a lot from them. And somewhere I also feel while you were narrating those field illustrations, it was also a visual and intellectual treat. So it was a good mix of the two. And personally, I also think, I love the map that you showed us. I have never seen that map earlier, and it was amazing. And of course, thanks for reminding us of the relevance of Gandhi in the present times. And the fears that we have when we're talking about Gandhi, which you just shared as a part of explanation. I think the fears are there, but also the relevance of Gandhi in the present times. And the realities that you just spoke about, I think they were, it's very thought provoking. And somewhere, during your talk, I also picked up a few points regarding fundamentals of Gandhian way of doing and living. You spoke about certain fundamentals, and I think they should go a long way to inspire each one of us by way of, building our confidence and going during our struggles. And also, I think when you also shared, how people are coming back to be with their families, that also is something very important, and as a part of self-reliance that needs to be thought about in serious ways. And our own happiness and the community's well-being are both equally important. As social workers, we really need to realize that. So that again I thought was very powerful. And Swaraj is, a feel of having adequate voice. Swaraj as good social relations, especially when it comes to, the equations between men and women. Where even in the 21st century, we are talking about women as as witch hunting. You're talking about women as paros, as women who are purchased. I think the entire social relations between men, women, and otherwise also, and access to not only just the basic amenities, but also all this kind of feeling, I think gets to be very important. And so it's actually been a lot of the other points also, but I'll not say much. But thanks a lot for sparing your time, and thanks Malti and Pratapji for coordinating it so well, and for the productive discussion that we have had. Thanks a lot, and thanks everyone who's been present with us throughout, and who's been putting those questions in the chat. And it's been a collective effort, and it's been inspiring once again to take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
And